This level begins with the player walking down a hallway with Gideon and Will. There is some exposition to bring the player up to speed on why they're here and what their goal is, as well as getting the player familiar with using the dialogue system. The player is given a seemingly innocent dialogue option when asked if they would prefer Gideon to be responsible for Mr. Pleasant's chip. I wanted the player to have a say in many of the events that took place, but I also wanted to leave room for surprises. An example of this is the player handing Mr. Pleasant's chip over to Gideon, later resulting in Mr. Pleasant being unable to protect the player from taking damage during a hack that occurs on the elevator ride up to Olympus. The player loses 25% of their health while Gideon is protected by Mr. Pleasant and does not lose health. If the player held on to Mr. Pleasant, they would be protected and Gideon would instead be the one to lose health. This also has later consequences I'll reveal soon. This is a fairly small consequence. I didn't want to unnecessarily punish the player for a decision they made without any knowledge of what may occur as a result. This was more to keep them on their toes and make the following combat encounters feel that much more tense and dangerous. The mercenaries then enter the elevator. There are several possible conversations that can play out on the way up. This is more exposition for the player's benefit, as well as to reassure the player that there is a very well thought out plan and they are with competent allies. This feeling of assurance disappears as Mr. Pleasant is cut off mid-sentence and Proteus invades the cyberware of Gideon and the player. Will is not hacked due to his lack of neural cyberware, but he instantly realizes something is not going according to plan. Proteus informs Gideon and the player that someone on their team has sold them out, but does not know who the culprit is. They are told to eliminate the other two mercenaries and the elevator will return safely to Serenity, but if this does not happen quickly, then the elevator will simply detach, killing everyone inside. This is an empty threat as Proteus is no longer in control of these systems while the lockdown is in place, but his paranoia still prompts it to come up with an alternative solution to unwanted guests entering Olympus. If Proteus can't kill them, maybe they'll kill each other. The player is also left wondering whether Gideon was told the same message or something different. This was intended to immediately cause distrust between the player and their allies. Olympus knows they are on their way up, making their mission more dangerous even if they reach the city alive, and with Mr. Pleasant cut off, the mercenaries began to suspect Mr. Pleasant used them as decoys to get close enough for him to escape into the city with no intention of following through on his end of the bargain. Mr. Pleasant, Proteus, Olympus, and now even the player's allies are all unknown variables. Gideon thinks someone sold out, the player is made to think someone sold out, Will doesn't know who to trust, and communication with the other teams has also been cut. This puts the player in a very tight spot, and they can either talk their way out of it, shoot Gideon, or Will, or both. A larger consequence of the earlier decision to either hold on to the chip or hand over responsibility to Gideon is apparent after the mercenaries are hacked by Proteus. When this occurs, Mr. Pleasant is momentarily cut off from communicating with the mercenaries. Several dialogue exchanges later, Mr. Pleasant returns to either the player or to Gideon, whoever had him last. The player doesn't know what the best option is every step of the way, but not saying anything could be even worse, and after 2 silences the player is forced to kill Gideon and Will when they turn on the player. The player only has a few consecutive dialogue opportunities if they want to lower their gun and convince Will to do the same, at which point Gideon calms down, reboots his system, and restores contact with Mr. Pleasant. If Pleasant returns to the player, he automatically reboots their system to restore contact. When this happens, there are 2 conversations at once. One in the player's head with Mr. Pleasant, and the other in real space with Gideon and Will. Mr. Pleasant assures the player that no foul play is at hand and everyone is innocent, but they are all still at each other's throats, and for the time being, Mr. Pleasant can only communicate with the player unless Gideon reboots his system. The only way to convince Gideon to reboot is by playing it cool, lowering your gun, and convincing Will to do the same. After Gideon reboots, Mr. Pleasant is able to contact him and clears up the confusion and mistrust. Gideon then relays this to Will. There is another method to keep everyone alive, which involves allowing Mr. Pleasant to possess the player and do the talking for them. It's risky to allow a rogue AI to possess your body for any amount of time. If the player agrees to it, they momentarily black out and are teleported to Olympus, where they wake up standing next to Gideon, Will, and Jade. In this case, Mr. Pleasant was successful in convincing the others not to kill each other. If the player did not have Mr. Pleasant, it is still possible to convince Gideon that neither the player nor Will have any intent to steer from the original plan, but it is more difficult as the player has no outside info from Pleasant to help, and Gideon is very uncooperative when Pleasant hijacks and reboots his system. Whatever the outcome, Mr. Pleasant informs those left alive that he had successfully backtraced Proteus when the hack began, and learned that Olympus is in lockdown and searching for Proteus just as they are. This means there is less time to accomplish their goal. Pleasant also explains that Proteus planted a virus in Pleasant's chip. The virus will reject the host, that is anyone with neural implants who slots Pleasant, and cause it to overheat their system. A new objective is given to the player and surviving members. Find and slot Pleasant into a terminal so he can perform a self-diagnosis and attempt to eradicate or alter the virus so that they may continue their primary objective of locating Proteus. The first combat encounter occurs during Pleasant's diagnosis. If Gideon and Will are dead, Jade is extremely paranoid because she thinks Mr. Pleasant is planning to kill them once he no longer has need of them. She calls the player as they fight to survive and says she doesn't trust Pleasant. The player can choose to engage in this conversation or not, agree with Jade or not, and confront Mr. Pleasant about his suspicious behavior or not. The main reason Jade accepted this gig was to get into Olympus, where there is an experimental treatment for her late-stage cybernetic implant rejection. If the player listens to Jade and agrees to confront Mr. Pleasant, there is the possibility of Mr. Pleasant possessing Jade unwillingly, which is made easier due to her condition. If confronted, Mr. Pleasant gives a reasonable defense of his actions, but Jade is not convinced he won't try to kill them. The player is given the option to tell Jade to back off, or they can wait and see what happens. If the player does nothing and simply watches, Mr. Pleasant possesses Jade for the remainder of the level. This does have the added benefit that the virus no longer considers Jade as a biological host to reject, so the player will not have to worry about managing burnout in the final combat encounter. Alternatively, after the diagnosis is complete, Mr. Pleasant informs those remaining that the virus is still present, but manageable for now, and that those with neural implants will need to remain in close proximity to one another in order for Pleasant to wirelessly transfer between them so as not to burn out any one person. What this means for the player in-game is that they'll have to keep an eye on which companion currently has Mr. Pleasant and how much time they have remaining before the virus will start draining their health. At this point, that person will seek a nearby companion so that Mr. Pleasant can swap hosts. There is a small cooldown period after a transfer has occurred where Mr. Pleasant must reconfigure the virus and prepare to transfer again. Essentially, the player will need to work with their companions in order to manage the debuff while also executing the other mechanics of the final encounter to keep everyone alive and succeed in their task. This was intended to make the final combat encounter more difficult and engaging, as the player will have to juggle this virus hot potato style in order to survive. This is made that much more difficult if only Jade is alive to help the player with this. The final combat encounter mechanics work as follows. Mr. Pleasant will tag one of 3 terminals, the outline of which will be visible through walls. The player will activate it, Mr. Pleasant will access a backdoor he created when he first back-hacked Proteus in the elevator, and overlay a node onto the player's vision. The player will then be equipped with a targeting system on their HUD. They just need to aim down sights in order to scan this node, which takes a few seconds, putting the player in a fairly vulnerable position. If the player does this quickly enough, Mr. Pleasant will force Proteus out of the local network, causing it to hijack one of the nearby combat bots at random. Mr. Pleasant will highlight which enemy is hosting Proteus. When the target takes damage, Proteus will slowly be weakened. Mr. Pleasant is betting on Proteus making a deal with them if desperate enough. The first time the player successfully scans the node and hacks Proteus, Olympus will be hot on their tail and a progress bar will appear. If the player takes too long to weaken Proteus, Olympus wins and will capture Proteus, and Mr. Pleasant will have lost his chance to directly communicate with the AI. The mission will have failed, but this is not a hard end to the level. If Mr. Pleasant wins, Proteus makes a deal with Mr. Pleasant, destroys the virus, and allows the surviving mercenaries to either leave the city or be registered citizens for as long as they desire. Every time the player successfully scans the node, Mr. Pleasant is able to hold back Olympus just a little bit, allowing for some back and forth. If the battle between Mr. Pleasant and Olympus takes too long, a background timer the player isn't even aware of triggers Proteus taking advantage of the extra time to use Mr. Pleasant as a scapegoat, and Olympus instead captures Mr. Pleasant, allowing Proteus to sneak out of Olympus with the player. Jade stays behind as she still intends to find a cure for her condition.